Israeli occupation soldier was captured by the Lebanese resistance movement Hezbollah. What happened that morning confirmed what we have suspected for a long time, that there were indeed South African citizens serving in the Israeli occupation army in defiance of South African law. Every freedom-loving South African had to endure the shame in front of the world that one of their fellow compatriots was captured serving in the military of the racist apartheid entity called Israel. Since then, there was a lot of lobbying to get government to act against these transgressors, but it soon became evident that there was no political will to enforce the laws of this country when it came to these criminals. This is the background that led to the formation of the South African Zionist Terrorism Corridor Probe, a comprehensive investigation and revelation of the extent of recruitment of mercenaries and violation of every aspect of the Foreign Military Assistance Act. The Zionists would want the world to believe that the conflict is a complex dispute over land. This is a lie. If you witness your neighbor's house being invaded, occupied, and its inhabitants driven out and killed, you don't call the police saying that there's a dispute at your neighbor's house. The use of the word dispute is to make the layman think that the occupier, the invader, and the usurper has some right to the land and homes he is invading. In essence, Israel was formed in a time when Europeans were occupying and invading third world countries at will. What happened was a smash and grab. The Zionist forces smashed the Palestinian people. The Zionist forces smashed the Palestinian people, and then they proceeded to grab the land. They drove the Palestinian people out of their country and denied them to ever return. This smash and grab continued from 1948 up until today in places like Sheikh Jarrah and other towns and villages in Jerusalem, where Palestinians are ethnically cleansed from their homes for foreign Jews to move into them. I do not believe that our National Prosecuting Authority has shown resolve in enforcing the Foreign Military Assistance Act. Our once proud position in relation to the Palestinian struggle for freedom has been tarnished by a small segment of our population. After 2006, the world views the South African authorities' inaction as complicit in the crimes perpetrated against the Palestinian people. The South African Zionist Terrorism Probe gives the National Prosecuting Authority, as well as the Directorate of Public Prosecution, the opportunity to restore the faith of the citizens of South Africa in its justice system and to shatter the strong and growing perception that we are not all equal in front of the law. I want to remind South Africans of the words of our late father of the nation, Nelson Mandela, who said that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. What this effectively means is that our struggle for our own freedom continues in our fight for the thoroughly investigated, prosecuted law. The South African Zionist Terrorism Probe is a culmination. We did this with great risk to ourselves. We will not settle for a newspaper headline or a news clip. We demand convictions and sentencing. Wassalam lil ahlihi. Peace to those who deserve it.
Okay, thank you, Safudin. I'll hand over to Zia. Just to say that we do have an executive summary of the complaint, and it's available free of charge to you, especially for the meeting.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. With the peace and blessings of the Almighty upon you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media fraternity, activists, comrades, and my fellow panelists. Indeed, today is a significant day in the struggle for Palestine, but not only the Palestinian struggle, the struggle where in all facets, the life and challenge of humanity is being at great risk. We must remember today all those that have been killed, displaced refugees in Western Sahara, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Myanmar, Ukraine, and of course, occupied Palestine. With permission of the panel, I'm going to ask everybody to please take a moment of silence to remember all victims of humanity. And then we will get into the details of why we are here today. Thank you. Members of the media fraternity, do not forget your pivotal role in an open and constitutional democracy. You are and continue to remain the fourth estate, the estate that keeps our government in check, that keeps our organs of state in check, and to ensure that there is accountability. Your position in society is pivotal in maintaining our constitutional democracy and upholding of fundamental human rights. What is the South African Zionist Terrorism Corridor Probe? As the principal complainant, Saifuddin Beste, has explained, it has taken significant amount of time and resources to dwell and to research the crux of how recruitment in South Africa happens and how the IDF recruits from South Africa and other international jurisdictions all over the world, and yet get away with it without any accountability and continue to perpetrate crimes against humanity, war crimes, and of course, being involved in terror-related activities. Indeed, today is a significant day, as I will reiterate, in our Palestinian struggle for human rights and to free our brothers and sisters from the oppression that they have been succumbed to for over 8 decades. The Zionist Terrorism Corridor Probe entails the utilization of South African legislation. South Africa has become part of the community of nations post-1994 as we dawned a new era where upholding of human rights would be crucial to our open and robust democracy. The crime of apartheid, of course, is well documented in occupied Palestine, and it constitutes a crime against humanity. The components of this case are quite intricate. Therefore, we have arranged for members of the media fraternity to receive an extensive executive summary which explains how and what the Terrorism Corridor Probe is all about. It includes the reliance of legislation and upon which organs of state we rely for that accountability, because the time for Zionist apartheid Israel has to come to accountability, and no longer can they continue to perpetrate crimes with complete and utter impunity. We have seen that all chaos and geopolitical conflict in the world today is funded and supported by the global military industrial complex. Let's not fool ourselves that humanity has got to the stage of production of arms and ammunition that can destroy the entire planet. We have seen cities in Ukraine decimated, Mariupol, Kharkiv, Kiev, in a matter of weeks, because humanity has got to that point of munitions funded by the global military industrial complex. And it is no different that Zionist apartheid Israel continues to be supported by the West, by the United States, by the United Kingdom, France, the European Union, where billions of dollars continue to be funded to the IDF. And the IDF in return uses those weapons of mass destruction in Gaza and in the occupied Palestinian territories, and then has the audacity of selling those weapons to other countries, noting that it is now battle tested against innocent civilians. Make no mistake, members of the media fraternity, ladies and gentlemen, that in this perpetration of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and nothing less than state terrorism perpetrated by Israel, we have South African nationals and citizens that brazenly commit themselves as young people, male and female, under the audacious so-called plan that it is their Jewish duty to go and serve Israel in murdering and slaughtering innocent human beings. And this is exactly what we are doing here today. We are now challenging South African nationals and citizens and institutions and enablers, those that source, recruit, fund this kind of complicity, breaking all laws of our country. I will get to a component of what is needed in terms of legislation that we still need to look at. But we are not short of legislation in this country to hold those accountable. I want to read up something on Norman Finkelstein. If I can just get it. One moment, please. This is what Norman Finkelstein says in his critique of the 2014 war, Operation Protective Edge, so that you can get an idea of what happens when these kinds of weapons of mass destruction are utilized on densely populated areas like in the Gaza Strip. And this kind of activity has happened in occupied Palestine, Gaza, Syria, not only Ukraine. However, our struggle for justice must be with the oppressed, all humanity that is oppressed. This is what Finkelstein says in his critique. And I'm going to read this, so please bear with me. Airstrikes. The United Nations report observed that as a result of Israeli airstrikes targeting residential and other buildings, at least 142 Palestinian families had 3 or more members killed in the same incident. Recalled respectively these scenes. I found the decapitated bodies of my uncle and daughter. My cousin was alive but died on the way to the hospital. Another cousin's body was found sliced in two. We had 10 corpses in the first ambulance. No other survivors were found. After having removed the cement, I identified my cousin Dina's body. What I witnessed was horrible. She was 9 months pregnant and she had come from her home to her parents' house to have her baby. We could not imagine that she had passed away. Her stomach was ripped open and the unborn baby was lying there with the skull shattered. We kept searching for other corpses and found my uncle's wife. We had great difficulty removing all the pieces of cement from her body. I had a close look at the bodies. Only the upper part of my 9-year-old daughter's body was left. My son Muhammad and his intestines coming out. My 16-year-old cousin had lost his 2 legs. My son Mustafa, who was 5 meters away from me, had received shrapnel that almost completely severed his neck. My 16-year-old nephew lost both his legs and arms. He asked for my help. I just really wanted him to die quickly. I didn't want him to go through so much suffering. There was also my 1-year-old daughter who was in her mother's arms. We found her body on a tree. I myself lost my left arm. The report was unable to find a possible military target in 6 of the 15 air assaults it investigated. In one such lethal attack absent, a military objective, a precision-guided 500-pound bomb targeted children on a roof who had gone there to feed the birds, killing 3 of them and injuring 2 others. And that goes on. That's the kind of atrocities that continue to be perpetrated by this regime with impunity. I will mention one more. Muhammad Hassan Ali Abadla, an ambulance driver, came under fire while evacuating an injured person. When the ambulance arrived at the location, the IDF instructed the crew to exit the vehicle and continue on foot. Muhammad Hassan Al-Abadla and one of 2 volunteers got out of the ambulance and approached the patient with a flashlight on as directed. They had walked about 12 meters when they came under fire, and Muhammad Hassan Al-Abadla was hit in the chest and thigh. 2 ambulance teams that arrived a little later to rescue their wounded colleague also came under fire, despite earlier ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross information that the IDF had approved the team was taken by hospital and Yunus, where he died shortly upon arrival. The ambulance movements were at all times coordinated with the IDF through the ICRC. And these witness reports are many. We've seen atrocities committed by the IDF against the media fraternity in the right of return. We've seen them attack journalists, ambulance drivers, medic personnel, and even UNRWA safe and protected schools where civilians and women are taking refuge. Life means absolutely nothing. So there's nothing different to what's happening in Ukraine. Would you agree? Ukraine, humanity is suffering. People are suffering. Human beings are suffering. Occupied Palestine, people are suffering. Depleted uranium used in Iraq has caused mothers to give birth to children with birth defects and deformities. Syria was razed to the ground. And as we will show you, what the IDF did in Shuhajia district, which is in the executive summary, will tell you that we have got to the stage where arms and ammunition have got to a point that can destroy entire cities, contribute significant problems to health and the environment, and to actual sustaining human life. And therefore, the time for accountability must go on. Over the last 10 years that I have been involved in advocacy for lawfare, we have been involved in various dockets, criminal complaints, lodged both with our local authorities in our organs of state, like the Hawks Unit and the National Prosecuting Authority. And also I've been part and privileged and honored to have represented a sister of this beloved city, Khadija Davids. Let's not forget Khadija's ordeal when she was aboard the Mavi Marmara, and the ordeal she experienced when she was captured, hijacked in international waters. As you know, the Freedom Flotilla mission was another war crime perpetrated by the IDF Navy. But this terrorism corridor brings all those other dockets and criminal complaints together into one single criminal complaint and indictment against the Zionist apartheid secular colonial regime called Israel, which continues to perpetrate war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression, colonialism, apartheid, and then goes on and on and on with complete complete impunity and unaccountability by the United Nations, by the International Criminal Court, all because of the political influence and the power play by the supreme nations that want to impose their agendas on the rest of humanity and the world. So how do we deal with this? We deal with this through effective lawfare advocacy by building national jurisdictions, building our own country's legal systems, enforcement agencies to say, if you will not do anything on the international arena, then we will do something within our national jurisdiction. And we will collaborate with other jurisdictions like Canada, where we know that foreign recruitment is happening, terrorism is happening, terrorism-related activities are happening on a daily scale. And by building and developing the laws, I know I've worked with the chair on what we call the IPSRA bill, the Implementation and Protection of Palestinian Solidarity Rights Act, is one component of pro-Palestinian advocacy that has different components, which has a boycotts, divestment, sanctions, lawfare, economic council committee that would be established. We've seen how quickly Russia has been sanctioned and embargoed by the Western nations, but it's taken 74 years with no sanctions, embargoes, or anything against the state of Israel. So we can create that legislation. We've also got in that legislation surveillance of those IDF soldiers, nationals and citizens in the country that want to go and serve in the IDF with a South African passport and leave at the exit permits with the Department of Home Affairs for them to be screened, and there must be surveillance. They are the terrorists. They are perpetrating terrorism on a wide scale. And let's not forget that these soldiers that get recruited through the structure, which is in the executive summary, are armed and well-trained with military munitions, a threat to our own national security. And it's of them becoming a threat to our security interests. They need to be probed in terms of what we call the Poctatara, protection of constitutional democracy against terrorism and related activities. We would have an opportunity to address questions in the Q&A program. I want to say the following. The component of the complaint The second part consists of the accused having contravened through their military service in the idea a broader scheme of willful and culpable acts of state terrorism, violating what we call the Anti-Terrorist and Related Activities Act, where applicable together with the Prevention of Crime, Organized Crime, the Prevention of Organized Crime Act, in respect of property that is either owned or controlled by or on behalf of an entity involved in terror-related activities. And the executive summary speaks about why we go against the South African Zionist Federation, the Jewish National Fund, the Zionist Federation of South Africa, TELFED, who is actively involved in recruitment in the Lone Soldier program. All of this is this broader network structure of young, impressionable male and female South African Jews who think that it is their religious duty to serve this abominable apartheid state that is effectively massacring Palestinians. Now, let's be clear. Let's be clear. This case is only. We know that the Israeli Defense Force has perpetrated war crimes, and you will see what they've done to Shuadia district. You will see that they have exercised, as Finkelstein would point, no distinction between military and civilians. Between a military target and a civilian person. That is the point of distinction. So they've already failed on distinction. Okay? And proportionality is the second component. So if they are in an active firefight with Hamas in the Gaza Strip, they use absolute no proportionality from their perspective, where they raise entire neighborhoods. And when you fail in distinction and proportionality with the kind of ammunition that is the United States and the UK and France are giving you, you destroy the whole neighborhood because you want to achieve a so-called military objective, which has failed in terms of international law. Another misconception that has been used at the United Nations, and we see it often in the Ukraine conflict in the United Nations Security Council, as an international-based order system, a rules-based, international rules-based order. What is that? International-based rules order. It is nothing less than violation of international law. Because what Israel is trying to do is change the facts on the ground by the Judaization of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and East Jerusalem neighborhoods. What the Americans are trying to do is justify their NATO and their military bases on everybody's doorstep, undermining the sovereignty of other nations. And they want to get away with their crimes with impunity. So they come up with this international-based rules order. Forgive me if I got the order wrong, but that's the crux of it. It's less than international law, and international humanitarian law, which is the ultimata of by which nations of the globe in the world must relate to, subscribe to, and respect. And I think that's what the principal complainant, Mr. Bester Safudin, is speaking about. Is let's not get caught up in this media frenzy that we see unfolding. So you push international law aside and you want to start talking about customary rules-based order system because you're changing facts on the ground. And that's what's happening in occupied Palestine, in the Judaization of East Jerusalem, the relocation of the US embassy to Jerusalem. And we know under international law, Jerusalem is still a final legal status issue, still to be determined. And there's the right of self-determination. There are United Resolutions 2334 and I think 184, 174, it talks about the Palestinians' right of return to their indigenous homeland. Where does that all fit? When 6 to 7 million Palestinians are living in the diaspora. But these South African Jews go to serve in the IDF because they want to make aliyah to their homeland. Because that is their religious duty to go to Israel. But you refuse Palestinians to return homes, which is international law, it is their right. And international law says, United Nations Resolution 2334 says that settlements cannot continue within the 67 borders. And coming to that is in your executive summary, where Michael Link draws the analogy between the expansion of the settlements and the settlements being constituting a war crime. So the expansion of settlements are a war crime. Now, the South African Zionist Jews that go to serve in the IDF, okay, are not only serving in the IDF in the units that relate to wars in the Gaza Strip, whether it was last year, 2014, 2012, or 2008, 2009. But they are maintaining the systematic oppression of Palestinians in the West Bank and in the occupied Palestinian territories. If you recall last year, there was an IDF soldier called David K., which the Zionist lobby were crying about. And their hearts were bleeding because a South African citizen was killed by a Palestinian fighter. Noting that Palestine is has the right of resistance. The anti-terrorism bill says, go and read the preamble. The anti-terrorism bill, the Tara Act, says that those nations that have the right of self-determination have the right to resist. And their resistance will not form part of terror-related activities. So there's these blinkers and these screens that the Zionists, through their media, want to beguile all of us and fool us to say that only when you support Palestine and only when you're a resistance fighter for Palestine and you speak about Hamas or Hezbollah, then you are a terrorist. But the act actually says that when you have the right to resist, it gives you that right to resist. And if you use arms in the right to resist, it doesn't constitute, per se, terror-related activities. In fact, it's the inverse that is true, is when you go and serve in a foreign army, either in the IDF or act as a lone soldier in that program, which is called the Lone Soldier Program, which is supported by the South African Zionist Federation in Telfed, and the Jewish National Fund that continues to greenwash forest programs on stolen Palestinian land. There's a lot for me to go into that kind of detail, but read through the executive summary. Because even the greenwashing of villages like Lubya and the greenwashing of homes or the land theft in East Jerusalem, the land theft in East Jerusalem, and then through a very complicated structure of theft of the land or through the absenteeism law, because Palestinians have been already, they've already through ethnic cleansing left that place. What's happened is in that situation, they have taken that land and they've sold it again through the KKL process and through Himnuta. And they've actually, what they've done is they have used it as money laundering to try and legalize an illegal or unlawful act. But Michael Link's report speaks about this as constituting a war crime. So we will have an opportunity to discuss all these different components, but predominantly this case is about South Africa's ratification of the Rome Statute. We have passed legislation called the Implementation of the International Criminal Court Act. We have the regulation of the Foreign Military Assistance Act. which says that if you want to serve in a foreign army as a lone soldier or as a mercenary, you have to get state cabinet approval. You have to get statutory approval, which is in terms of Section 4 and 5 of the legislation. And in none of this that we are, these complainants, the complainants in identifying the accused suspects, is there any evidence or proof that these people have indeed obtained the permission or approval in terms of the regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act? We call it the FMAA, or you can call it the RF, Regulation Foreign RFMAA. So already there's a clear violation. And then the evidence is incontrovertible and irrefutable by their own admission on social media posts. And I will show a few images of this, where they are serving brazenly in the IDF, breaking the RFMAA Act. Okay, there's no evidence that they have required the authorized or got the authorizations or approvals. And then it's this terrorism-related activities, as the human rights fact-finding missions reports have said, that their actions, apartheid state Israel's actions, has been there to terrorize civilian population. And let me get back to why I say population, because in a firefight, you raise down a whole community or neighborhood through the military-industrial complex of ammunitions. Okay? And what is that? That is collective punishment. Collective punishment is unlawful, illegal under international law, the Geneva Conventions, and international humanitarian law. And that kind of wide-scale state terrorism, we make a case out in terms of the terror-related activities. We rely on this legislation, and we have no doubt that the time has gone for accountability. This is an important press conference because we will be releasing details of the executive summary, and you will have the opportunity of knowing exactly how this whole system is working in our South African constitutional democracy, where crimes continue to be perpetrated. I will have time to speak more about it in a Q&A session, but we have damning investigations on the South African Zionist Federation, TELFED, and these other institutions. In fact, the Jewish National Fund and the South African Zionist Federation even have the same principal place of business. And there's this close network of sourcing, recruiting South African citizens to go and serve illegally and unlawfully in the IDF. My time is coming up now. I want you to remember what Michael Link said, that settlements continue to be a war crime. And these institutions are perpetrating war crimes they are perpetrating war crimes by supporting this expansion policy in East Jerusalem, by arbitrary military laws. We know what they're doing to Palestinian children in the West Bank. They don't have proper rights of legal representation. Different laws for Israeli Arabs and Israelis themselves. And that's well documented in terms of the amnesty reports and so forth. To give you an example, we have decided to list the accused and to publicly say that it is in the public interest that the accused names be known who are implicated in these egregious crimes against humanity, so that the media fraternity in the fourth estate, as I call it, would be able to investigate and apply the necessary pressure that is required on our authorities and have a robust discussion in the public domain so that the narrative begins to change and that we call out these terrorists for what they really are. So these are South Africans. These are South Africans serving in the IDF. And all these are social media posts where they've incriminated themselves. There's been stories of where parents have in fact went to occupied Palestinian territory and met with their children in the IDF. And there's evidence of South Africans serving in the IDF where they've come back to South Africa to visit their parents and their families, which is supported. The Israel Center for Cape Town. Involved in the Lone Soldier program. So it comes back to what I've initially said, that these individuals are perpetrating terrorism and war crimes. And it's not only in the Gaza Strip, but it's in the OPTs. The occupied Palestinian territories as well. And they remain proud of what they are doing, keeping in mind what I had mentioned earlier in Finkelstein's excerpt about how Palestinian families completely get wiped out. All these images and all this evidence has been provided to the South African police authorities, to the Hawks Unit and the Director of Priority Crimes Investigation. This is another suspect. All these suspects are majors. They are not minors. Their identity does not need to be protected in terms of a criminal investigation. And we've been involved in doing this work and trying to hold these criminals accountable for over 10 years now. So we are requesting that there must be a new narrative and a new dialogue in this country. We must continue to build our lawfare advocacy structures because we know that political influence by the nations of the globe hold us to ransom. And one of the components of that is to utilize the existing legislation that we have, which I've made reference to. And I hope I've mentioned it. I mentioned all the legislation, and including that we must start fighting for the IPSRA bill to be passed as law that deals holistically with Palestinian solidarity rights in this country. This is what's going on. Remember when Palestinians were fighting for their right of return on the fences of Gaza and Israeli snipers were killing them off like flies? South Africans are implicated in war crimes, crimes against humanity, and terrorism and terror-related activities. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Zia. So about 3 weeks ago, our complaint, you've seen a copy of the documentation that was laid with the NPA, the National Prosecuting Authority in Estonia. Okay, I'll just repeat that because I was muted on Zoom. What I was saying is that about 3 weeks ago, we lodged our complaint with the National Prosecuting Authority, the NPA in Pretoria, and now we're waiting on them to do their own investigation and to decide whether they will be prosecuting those who we've complained against. We're waiting for that outcome. And just judging from a previous case lodged by Safuni Beste in 2014, that case is still not decided whether they're going to prosecute against the accused there. So we hope this case will not take the same length of time because we think there's an urgency to it. And we're hoping that the NPA will get down to business and inform us as soon as possible. Open for questions from you, and I'll also check on Zoom. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm seeing everything here. Anyone? Okay.
The name is the last time that the soldier was killed, we didn't hear anything from the South African government saying that that soldier was a mercenary. What is your take on calling the mercenaries? The soldiers that go from South Africa and then go to the army.
So, okay, so sorry, it's Muslim matters. A question about whether the term mercenaries would apply to those who we've accused serving in the IDF. Okay, Zia?
Thank you for your question. Important one as well. South African legislation, as mentioned earlier, it's the RFMAA, Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act. In the definition of the RFMAA legislation, rendering military assistance, the rendering of military supposed to be repealed. There is another act called the Prohibition of Mercenary Activities. The act has been passed, however, due to regulations not yet been passed. The Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act continues to be valid, and that's the legislation that we must rely on. So it's about rendering military assistance. So two components in terms of our investigation. The first is that impressionable South African Zionist Jews go to serve, and they do that because they also beguiled, and they think it's their religious duty to do so. And it opens other opportunities for them. So they could serve in the IDF, get paid in the IDF. They get bursaries. They get the opportunity of going to maybe study at the university there, and also probably a start in their own life. But they don't realize they're actually settlers in a colonial state. And the Foreign Military Assistance Act also recognizes the term mercenary. So mercenary would be an independent kind of soldier that goes to serve for financial gain. So there's no difference because it's any form of rendering of military assistance. There was quite a lot said about David Kay when he was in the West Bank when he was killed. And as I've mentioned earlier, that he was nothing less than actually violating the laws of our country and being part and parcel of the systematic oppression of Palestinians who are living under basically apartheid and colonialism. And if some of them, like some of the other suspects that we've identified, have actually been placed in either 2014 or even in last year's war in Gaza. So it's either wars in Gaza or it's also about that military, the belligerent military occupation by the IDF.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Just introduce yourself.
Related to national jurisdiction and how we can and also how that will how that, or if it could influence international.
Great question.
Yeah.
So countries around the world are different in terms of how their legal system is structured. And predominantly our legal system was Roman Dutch and components of English law when you look at the law of contracts and so forth. But what is significant is that post 1994, remember South Africa was a pariah state. South Africans were perpetrating, apartheid government was perpetrating war crimes and were perpetrating crimes in subsidizing the apartheid and sustaining that kind of system, right? So post 1994, we signed international resolutions, and more importantly, we signed the Rome Statute, and that was ratified in terms of whereby we domesticated the Rome Statute in terms of our law. So we have international obligations, and those international obligations are drawn that we sign internationally, but so constitutional imperative to do so, that we must interpret international law consistent with our, there must be a consistent interpretation of international law. And where there's a disparity, then we must be able to apply international law because we became part of a community of nations. So nothing stops us from building that sort of national jurisdiction. And I think the great team that we have here is that we've already been involved in strategic partnerships with other lawyers and activists across the globe in helping and assisting them. So we've provided our criminal legal complaint to our close allies and our strategic partners so that they can have a look at how we've done it here, because this is a novel case. This is the first. I mean, I'm an international human rights lawyer. It's part of what I do, one component. I work with the International Campaign for the Legal Defense of Our Courts, the Defense Council. And these legal teams and legal strategies are still getting there. So this case that we've put together is at the stage where we have that ability to influence the narrative and influence how law should be developed. And I come back to this and may perhaps read a bit about the IPSRA bill, which is the Implementation and Protection of Palestinian Solidarity Rights. A long time for me to draft that bill, but it's critical and crucial to us building national jurisdictions in terms of Palestinian solidarity. So we can use the existing legislation, which is of general application. But the reality is that there won't be a Palestine left. Remember I spoke about the facts on the ground are changing, right? The Judaization program, if you look at the executive summary, it speaks about settlers. Virginia Kelly talks about how many settlers at a particular time, how many settlers have now moved into Palestinian land. That they're changing the facts on the ground. That's the international rules-based order, completely ignoring international law. And unfortunately, we know that the United Nations needs to be strengthened. We know that there's problems at the Security Council. We should not be having the kind of conflict we're seeing in Ukraine today, or the kind of conflict in occupied Palestine, if there was a fair system of international recognition of international law in terms of the Security Council. So, sorry, I'm going a bit more on this, but I'm saying that we can build those national jurisdictions through strengthening our law, working closely with our partners, showing them what the IPSRA bill would look like, what are the laws that we have that they can probably lobby their parliamentarians and politicians to say, we want these laws to be passed. In this instance, Ireland is doing some good work. Our Scottish comrades are doing good work. And there are some positive developments in terms of isolating apartheid Israel. And why? Why the international response to Ukraine, to Russia? Perpetrating war crimes, probably. Right? Sanctions and all of that. But why is the international community not applying that same pressure? Why the double standards? And that's where we need to stand up with the oppressed.
Let's just check on Zoom if there are any questions. Any more questions? Let's just see on Zoom. Okay, this is the question about the executive summary. We will make the executive summary available on our website, and how else we'll also post it through email for those of you who don't get the hard copy now, for those who signed up. Okay, any more questions over there?
I just wanted to inquire, besides the NPA, National Prosecuting Authority, which is one of the main regulating authorities in the country, is there any other mechanism which can ensure that these South Africans who are going over to Zionist enforced? If there is another mechanism besides the NPA or in the NPA itself, I can space is already these are evidence of local international report. The other comment is any regulatory framework besides the legislation which we sort of mentioned that can ensure that people just doesn't go automatically and sign up and easily go into the ID from South Africa's side. Is there any regulatory framework to ensure that they just don't go away? As is the same case where people in the Ukrainian government currently are showing their support towards Israel and are going there over despite the suffering the whole nation is facing, and ensure that the cancer of Zionism in general does not spread other parts of the world as actually Syria, Iraq, I think it's Yemen. Yemen is also one of the main areas where Saudi Arabia is unfortunately what they were doing the innocent access in Yemen, where you have American jets flying over Yemen and the bullets of the missiles which are flying at the innocent Yemeni people and children being hit by Israeli missiles. That's something.
To ensure prosecution and conviction, because he expressed some concern and skepticism with the NPA, given that there are many cases that have taken long years and still no prosecution, let alone conviction. So that's the one question. The second, if there's any other regulatory framework that could prevent people from signing up for the IDF. And I think he used examples of current wars and attacks on innocent people in several countries, whether there isn't any other mechanism to prevent people from fighting, I suppose, in unjust and brutal wars in various parts of the world.
Thank you for your question. And quite rightly, you have reminded me that indeed Yemenis are also suffering huge atrocities. And once again, the funders and financiers is the global military industrial complex and the pacification of these nations through wars and other conflict. Remember, the Middle East is about, there's a grand agenda about balkanization of the 6 states into smaller states that are controllable, and their resources can be violated and used. And that's the imperial agenda that continues to create and provide the evidence of the conflicts we're experiencing. Coming back to your question about, is there any other regulations? This is the core piece of legislation, the Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act. And we've also domesticated the Rome Statute, which is the International Criminal Court Act. We are strongly trying to advocate the IPSRA bill, which would come with its own section and provisions of accountability and strengthening what is out there, but particularly to the Palestinian cause, because what's ongoing in Palestine is in fact genocide. let's not make any, say it for what it is. It's incremental genocide. Settler colonial states are prone to perpetrating genocide. And this was done by this is recorded by international human rights scholars, and it is in the executive summary. We also make note of the point of Amnesty International, so finding that Israel is an apartheid state. And I don't know if you remember, there was a few years ago the Esquire report that was then retracted by the UN, because they in fact already found that Israel was perpetrating apartheid. So the Amnesty International report actually just reaffirms what was then a political motivation to withdraw or retract that UN Esquire report. But interestingly, the case of Khadija Davids is important here, because by building national jurisdictions, and what we had done in her case in the Mavi Mamra in 2010 was that we built international collaboration with our international partners. There wasn't a chance that Israeli war commanders would set foot on South African territorial jurisdiction. And we already had a huge case happening in Turkey, Istanbul at the time. And they have a legal system where they preserve evidence. I speak about Sheikh Ra'id Salah, the Lion of Al-Aqsa. When coming back to terrorism, there's evidence that Sheikh Ra'id Salah gives in Istanbul, Turkey, that they did not know, the IDF did not know that there was a second radio signal being transmitted when they aborted the Mavi Marmara. And they had all intention to assassinate Sheikh Ra'id Salah. Time of terrorism, right? But when they found that there was a second radio signal being transmitted, they backed off a little bit. That is, we make some reference to the summary. What was important in terms of the international collaboration was that we were successful enough to receive for our local authorities to enforce the international Turkish arrest warrants, whereby a red alert was issued. That was a huge case. I mean, this was a sister of Cape Town that did a fundamental advocacy for Palestinian rights and, of course, protection of our own rights, where we demanded that South African citizens' rights must be protected. That if these Israeli war commanders that sanctioned these Israeli commanders that sanctioned this kind of attack, if they had come to South Africa, they would have been arrested. And because there was a case happening in Turkey, they could have been extradited. Now, the terrorism-related activities deals a lot with this extradition. It also speaks about, if there's jurisdictional questions, then you must look at where the accused are found or where the crime has been perpetrated, and they must be dealt with in that jurisdiction. Because this kind of law is not only South African, but it can be using collaborative effort in other national jurisdictions. So I hope that answers it. But clearly, in terms of our legislation, these are South Africans. They say they've made aliyah to occupied Palestine, but there is evidence in our criminal complaint of, in fact, in one case where one of the accused suspects gives his parents a surprise visit. He comes back to South Africa, doesn't tell his parents that he's here, and there was, and he records it. All of this is, they incriminate themselves here. There's incriminating evidence on social media and videos, and in fact, even their family incriminate their own children by posting on social media, not maybe arrogantly, brazenly, or they just don't know. They think they're in a cowboy state. South Africa would allow this kind of things to happen. So we can then strengthen our institutions, Department of Home Affairs. And that's why IPSA is so important, because it gives that coordinated effort amongst departments and national ministries to focus particularly on this kind of crime that is being perpetrated. So that Department of Home Affairs is made aware, South African police services are made aware, and that they're not allowed to leave the country. Or if they come into South Africa, they're immediately arrested and they must then face prosecution. And if we are building these national jurisdictions, and my view is that we must continue to advocate at the International Criminal Court. We must continue to advocate at the United Nations Human Rights Council and the UN. I've had the opportunity of addressing the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva in 2016 on Palestinian prisoners' rights and children's rights. And good resolutions come out of the UNHRC, but we know that those resolutions have to be implemented by sanction to Security Council or the General Assembly. And that's where the power play in politics is happening. But if we build national jurisdiction, and there's evidence here that there was a South African married to a Canadian. South African married to a Canadian in the evidence. I recall there's evidence of that. So if we're building with our Canadian counterparts and they married across two countries and they go to Canada, they may not be arrested here, but they can face arrest in Canada. And that is the lawfare advocacy that we need to be building.
Okay. There are questions on Zoom as well. Are there legal implications for South African solidarity organizations supporting Palestine's armed resistance? And then also a question about, can you share how the NPA has responded to your overtures and the news that the case will be going ahead? Okay, those two questions. And then maybe Yusuf, if you can also go for it.
I was interested in what Paul's experiences were in handling this, but my two questions is, why did it take so long for this complaint to be lodged? Why is the previous case, is it in number, if that is the correct what is the confidence level that we have in the South African judiciary? Seeing what the Chief Justice said previously, although he was sanctioned for it, but we have judges there who serve on the South African Jewish Board of Deputies under the cover of charity work, but advising them know how to promote the interests of apartheid Israel. Given that now recently has characterized what Israel as an apartheid state. Now, how can they have apartheid judges supporting apartheid causes on the, and wouldn't that be an impediment in a fair trial eventually when we get to this? So those are my three questions.
Okay, I'm going to respond to speak on the floor, and then I'll just ask you to repeat the other two from Zoom. Oh, okay, all right. I think the problem with the South African judiciary and the Zionist influence is not across only the legal South African judiciary, but across the spectrum of society, whether it's economics, financial, and political. Let's not forget the political influence that the Zionist lobby has. And I think one of the important aspects of this case is breaking down those narratives that are so deeply entrenched in our society and in mainstream media, that stories are taken on face value to be true. That when it's somebody of a different color or race, it's terrorism. But when it's somebody else of a different white color and speaks eloquently, then it's not terrorism, but they are in the right. So this continues to be a challenge within the judicial formation, the appointment of our judges. And indeed, when those judges that support apartheid Israel make pronouncements in the public space, they are complicit and they're aiding and abetting apartheid, which is a crime against humanity, and they must be held accountable. Why did this case take so long? I mean, resources, time, activists. What does it take? This case was not just produced in a month. It took, in fact, a good few months to research and get the evidence so that we can be confident here today as the panel to say that we will stand by what we've said. We are confident enough to list these accused South Africans for being complicit in breaking the laws. And that takes time, resources, and a great deal of investigation to ensure that a good product is produced. But what's important for us is here today and in fact, for the last decade, there has been cases. I've been party to at least 3 cases. The Gaza docket in 2008, 2009. In fact, already that time there was a report by Virginia Tully and others that spoke about the cantonization of Palestinian settlements. and the crime of apartheid. I was honored enough to represent Ronnie Casfield in that complaint where we make out an extensive case for apartheid. And that's clear. It's now sort of a discovery by Harvard University, but it's been out there for years, for at least a decade or more, that Israel was perpetrating apartheid, constituting a crime against humanity. But ladies and gentlemen, I think what's important is that break down the narratives. And this case must be the beginning of the end of this culture of impunity. And I've said this to our National Prosecuting Authority. And remember that, linked to the previous question, is that we are citizens of a constitutional democratic state, and we have organs of state that are legislated and empowered to do specific things. So an investigation is done by the South African Police Services in terms of legislation. A prosecution arising from a successful investigation will be done by the National Prosecuting Authority. I'm more than confident to say that we have more than just a prima facie case. We have a case here, in fact, against the suspects and accused against on the RFMA to sustain a successful prosecution. And we ask the Zionist institutions to be investigated for their terrorism and their terror-related activities, as we've set out in the criminal complaint, adducing sufficient evidence and of the structure and how this whole network has been established that makes them complicit in terrorism and terror-related activities. I hope that answers your question. Not the South African Jewish, not the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, but the Jewish National Fund has been. Just give me a moment to read the questions here.
Also, the Zionist Terrorism.
Can you share how the Yeah, so the question here is, can you share how the NPA has responded to your overtures and the news that the case will be going ahead? Well, let's understand that our prosecuting and investigative authorities are not in the media space. They've got a particular function to do with, and which is within their constitutional duty, and that is now to investigate. There was an important case a few years ago by the Constitutional Court that actually set the precedent. I call it the Zimbabwean Exile Forum. It was the South African Human Rights Litigation Center, and it was against the Minister of Police, where we dealt with the case on international crimes and the implementation of the International Criminal Court Act. And this was in relation to what was happening in Zimbabwe during the elections. And that becomes the precedent case for what we are dealing with now, is that the investigative and prosecuting authorities have to investigate the case. You can't take a criminal complaint to them and they'll say they're not going to investigate or there's insufficient evidence. They have to allocate a case number. There must be a preliminary inquiry. And like in the case of the Mavi Marmara, they have to look at what resources are available and if they're able to investigate and prosecute on South African territory, or if there would be another jurisdiction that would be able to do that. And I think the Anti-Terrorism Act also provides the kind of jurisdictional requirements and looking at the kind of ability and capability of the NPA and the police after a successful investigation, whether it can be done in this country or whether it needs to be done in another jurisdiction. I think that
there was a question about, are there any implications for those solidarity organizations that support arms struggle? The Palestinians, arms struggle.
Okay. So international law, I've never seen anywhere in international law not giving the right of the oppressed to the right of resistance. The right of resistance is a fundamental right. In fact, it's a right to dignity, to resist occupation, to resist terrorism, to resist any form of usurping of your land or your property or to safeguard your own person. And let's understand that, this is again a contextual issue in how the United States and the imperial agenda, if you look at the 2003 invasion of Iraq under false pretenses of weapons of mass destruction, or destroying an entire country like Afghanistan on the premise that, Osama bin Laden was a threat to your national security. We have to be very careful that we do not get into that space, all right? Because then what happens is this complete breakdown of international law, norms, and standards, where you take this right to preempt a strike, but your actual territory or your actual body or person or property has not yet been harmed. In fact, it doesn't even comply with self-defense or private defense, for instance, where there's an imminent threat or harm. And that's again where they're going back to this international rules-based system, but it's not international law per se. So we must keep that in mind.
Yeah, okay. All right, any more questions? Okay, there's nothing on Zoom. Okay, there's a hand over there.
Social mercenaries deployed to Israel from South Africa, and he was killed in Gaza. And what required the government on international relations operations, they sent out a but they sent out that they felt condolences as well as to regulation. I just want to inquire, does this create some sort of ambiguity? Because the ANC is not, we all know, is the cause of support them. At the same time, as you saw, there's now, of course, I'm reading what one of the officials as well as I think of to that we got behind it. But is the ANC stance that have any account with the
Okay, the question was about the mercenary young South African who was killed. He was serving in the IDF and he was killed in East Jerusalem last year. And the concern expressed is that the Department of International Relations and Cooperation sent a letter of condolence to this member of the IDF. And the question is really about whether there isn't ambivalence on the part of the state authorities in dealing with those who serve in the IDF. We did, as part of the SABDS coalition, our national office wrote a letter to DIRCO expressing our disappointment and disapproval with that message that was sent to the family. Obviously, on the one hand, it's a death of an individual, but on the other hand, we complained about the politics of it all, that in effect, what DIRCO was doing was condoning IDF recruits from South Africa and what they are doing in Palestine. So we did raise our objections to that in a formal letter at the time. It was done through the SABDS coalition. Okay, are there any more questions? If not, then I think that's it for the press conference. Thank you to everyone for attending. Thanks to our team, our panel. Just to say that we deliberately organized this press conference during, as you know, Israel Apartheid Week, which is from Monday, until next Monday, the 28th. However, on Tuesday next week, we'll be having an international webinar, which will focus on this issue, but more from an international perspective. And we'll be having the two comrades here on the panel, but as well as a Canadian representative, because they're taking up a similar case in Canada. Her name is Karen Rodman, and she'll also be on the panel, and that starts at 8 o'clock in the evening on Tuesday. part of the reason for so late, of course, the difference in time zone. So we want to accommodate everyone globally. So just note that next Tuesday, the 29th, 8 p.m., our international webinar on IDF recruitment from various parts of the world. As you know, the Zionist movement is an international movement. Okay, let's see. Oh yes, and the executive summary that you see here, and you can collect a copy for yourself, is available online. Where will we post it? The PSC. The PSC website. It will be available on the PSC website. So feel free to download. Okay, thank you very much. And that's the end of our press conference. And thanks to Community House for providing the venue. And of course, to the media team, Lutfi, Sharon from Workers' World Media Productions, thank you for covering it. Okay, everyone online, on Zoom, we are done now. Thank you very much for attending, and stay well, and hope to see you at the webinar next week. Bye. Well done, Fabi.